The brand on her neck was a constant, cold companion. It was a circle of scarred flesh, a permanent reminder that she was less than nothing. They called her Ilara. They called her Omega. They called her Branded. Each name was a stone thrown at her, and she had learned long ago to build a wall with them inside her own mind. Her world was the kennels, a place of damp straw, cracked stone, and the perpetual scent of wet fur and misery. Here, the pack's lowest members fought for scraps and warmth, their lives as disposable as the bones they gnawed on. Ilara's life was even less than that. The brand marked her not just as an Omega, but as the daughter of a traitor, a stain on the pack's honor that they were forced to endure. It was why she did it. It was why she risked the beatings, the starvation, the hate that followed her like a shadow. Down in the discard pit, where the weak and sick were thrown to be reclaimed by the winter, she had found him. A pup, barely a week old, his back leg twisted into a useless gnarled thing. His littermates had been strong. He had been deemed an error, an offense to their pack's predatory perfection. They had thrown him away to die. She had not let them. Every night, she stole away. She would save a morsel of her own meager ration, a crust of hard bread, a sliver of gristle, and creep to the edge of the ravine. She would whistle, a low, soft sound that was hers and his alone, and he would come, dragging his broken body from the shadows of the rocks. She had named him Fen. It meant monster in the old tongue, a name to ward off the cruelty of others. To her, it meant survivor. Tonight, the wind was a blade. It sliced through her thin tunic, raising gooseflesh on her arms. The cold was a physical ache in her bones, a familiar pain that she had learned to ignore. She huddled behind a frozen boulder, the stolen piece of dried meat clutched in her hand. It was so small, barely enough to sustain a pup, but it was all she had. Fen, she whispered into the wind. A scrabbling sound answered her. He emerged from the darkness, bigger now than when she'd first found him weeks ago, but still painfully thin. His gray fur was matted, but his eyes were bright, intelligent, and fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He limped heavily, his twisted leg dragging uselessly behind him, yet he moved with a fierce determination that made her own heart ache with a strange, fierce pride. He took the meat from her hand with a gentleness that belied the hunger in his eyes. He didn't tear at it. He licked her frozen fingers first, a warm, wet touch that was the only kindness she ever knew. She watched him eat, her stomach clenching with its own emptiness. This was her secret, her crime. To show mercy was weakness. To care for the deformed was to invite the same fate. If the pack alpha Valerius ever found out, he would not hesitate. He would throw her in the pit right alongside the pup. A horn blast echoed from the fortress on the high cliff, a deep, mournful sound that vibrated through the stone beneath her. It was a sound they hadn't heard in a decade. The king was returning. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the dull ache of her existence. The Alpha King, Kale. A name spoken only in hushed, terrified whispers. He was ancient, a creature of ice and shadow who ruled the northern wastes with an iron fist. He had not been seen in their valley for 10 years, content to let his council, led by the cruel Valerius, manage the pack. His return could only mean something terrible was coming. Ilara scrambled to her feet. She had to get back before she was missed. She gave Fen one last look, his luminous eyes watching her. There was no fear in them, only a strange, knowing calm. She turned and ran, her worn boots slipping on the icy ground, the king's horn still echoing in her ears. It sounded like a death knell. The next day, the pack was assembled in the main yard. It was a rare, mandatory gathering. Alphas stood at the front, their chests puffed with pride and arrogance. Betas stood behind them, their gazes sharp and wary. And at the very back, huddled by the kennels, were the Omegas. Ilara kept her head down, the rough wool of her hood pulled low to hide the brand on her neck. A hush fell over the crowd, so sudden and absolute it was like the world had stopped drawing breath. He walked through the main gates. The Alpha King was not a man. He was a force of nature, taller than any wolf she had ever seen, with shoulders as broad as the northern mountains. He wore no crown, only simple black leathers that did nothing to hide the sheer brutal power coiled in his frame. Snowflakes melted an inch from his skin, his body radiating an aura of such intense cold that the air around him seemed to shimmer. His hair was the color of midnight, and his face was all harsh lines and predatory beauty, as if carved from a glacier. But it was his eyes that held the true terror. They were a pale, piercing ice blue, devoid of any warmth or emotion. They swept over the assembled pack, and under that gaze, alphas lowered their heads. Betas flinched. Omegas trembled. It was the gaze of a being who had seen centuries turn to dust and found them all wanting. Valeria stepped forward, bowing low. "Your Majesty, we are honored by your unexpected return." The king did not look at him. His gaze continued its slow, methodical sweep of the crowd. He was searching for something. Alara pressed herself further into the shadows, making herself small, invisible. Praying, "Please don't let him see me. Don't let him see the brand." His eyes passed over her. For a moment, she thought she was safe. She risked a small, shuddering breath. Then his gaze snapped back. It locked onto her. Through the crowd, past the bodies of alphas and betas, he saw her. It was impossible. She was nothing, a shadow against a wall. But he looked at her as if she were the only person in the entire yard. A strange, unreadable expression crossed his frozen features. It wasn't anger. It wasn't cruelty. It was recognition. He started walking. The crowd parted before him like the sea before a winter storm. He ignored the bowing alphas, the sycophantic greetings from the council. He walked a straight, unwavering line, his destination clear. Her. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it. He'd seen the brand. He was coming to pass judgment, to finish the work her father's treason had started. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, for the cold hand that would drag her to her death. He stopped directly in front of her. The cold radiating from him was so intense it stole the air from her lungs. She could feel the stares of the entire pack burning her back. Slowly, terrified, she forced her eyes open and looked up. He was staring not at her face, but at the ground near her feet. She followed his gaze. A small, muddy paw print was visible on the stone, left from her run back from the ravine last night. It was misshapen, the toes splayed at an unnatural angle, the mark of a twisted foot. Fenn's mark. The king's ice-blue eyes lifted from the print and met hers. For the first time, she saw something flicker within their depths. A flicker of something other than cold. It was a question, an understanding. He knew. Somehow, he knew. He didn't speak to her. He raised a hand, his fingers long and pale and pointed. Not at the brand, not at her face, directly at her. He turned his head slightly, his voice a low rumble that was not loud, but carried across the silent yard with absolute authority. Her! Valerius hurried to his side, his face a mask of confusion. Your Majesty? The Omega? She is a branded— Bring her to the fortress, the king commanded, his voice like the cracking of ancient ice. He turned and walked away without a backward glance, the crowd parting for him once more. Alara was left standing there, frozen in a bubble of stunned silence. The entire pack stared at her, their expressions a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning hatred. She had been chosen. She, the worthless, the branded, the stain. And she had no idea if it was a reprieve or a death sentence. The fortress was a place of cold stone and colder silence. Alara was stripped of her rags, scrubbed raw by two grim-faced servants, and dressed in a simple gown of soft gray wool. The fabric was warmer than anything she had ever worn, but it did nothing to stop the trembling in her limbs. She was led through vast echoing halls, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and portraits of kings with eyes as cold as the one who now ruled. She was brought to a small Spartan room with a bed, a table, and a hearth, where a fire crackled merrily. It was more luxury than she had known in her entire life. It felt like a trap. Lord Valerius entered without knocking. His face was pinched with displeasure, his thin lips a bloodless line. "The king has made a strange decision," he began, his voice slick with condescension. "He has ordered you to be quartered here. You will serve him directly." Alara said nothing, her hands clenched in the soft wool of her new dress. "Let me be clear, Omega," Valerius continued, stepping closer, his eyes glinting. "This is not an honor, it is a whim. The king is an ancient and powerful being. His moods are like the winter storms, unpredictable and dangerous. You are here for a purpose he has not seen fit to share. Your duty is to obey. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not look him in the eye. You will perform whatever task he sets for you without question. There will be no intimacy. There will be no connection. Do you understand?" She gave a small, jerky nod. "He is not a man you can charm or manipulate," Valerius hissed, his gaze dropping to the brand on her neck, which the high collar of the gown failed to completely hide. "He is a force of nature, and forces of nature crush things." He left her there, his warning hanging in the air like frost. This was the arrangement. She was a tool, a curiosity, a thing to be used and discarded. It was a familiar role, just with warmer clothes. The first few days were a study in silence and fear. The king would summon her to his solar, a vast circular room at the top of the highest tower, lined with shelves of ancient books. He would sit by the window, staring out at the snow-swept peaks, and say nothing. He would simply observe her. She was tasked with stoking the fire, her movements stiff and awkward under his unnerving gaze. She never looked at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the flames. But she could feel him. His presence was a weight, a cold pressure in the room that made the fire's warmth feel like a lie. On the third day, everything changed. She entered the solar to find a small, makeshift den of furs and blankets had been set up near the hearth. Curled within it, sleeping soundly, was Fen. A gasp escaped her lips before she could stop it. She clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. He'd brought the pup here, into the heart of the fortress. "He will be more comfortable here," the king's voice rumbled from the shadows. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly. The sound vibrated through her, deep and cold. She dared a glance at him. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "You will tend to him," he commanded, "here, in my presence." And so, a new routine began. Every day she would spend hours in the king's solar, tending to Fen. She would clean his fur, massage his twisted leg with salves the servants provided, and feed him the rich, cooked meat that was a world away from the scraps he'd known. And the entire time, the king would watch. The silence between them was a living thing. But slowly, something began to shift. Fen, in this warm and safe place, began to thrive. He grew stronger, his coat gaining a healthy sheen. He adored Alara, but he showed the king a strange, quiet respect. He would often limp over and lay his head on the king's boot, and the great cold Alpha King would not move, simply allowing the contact. One afternoon, as she was gently stretching Fen's bad leg, the king spoke again. "The brand." Alara froze, her hand still on the pup. "Who gave it to you?" His voice was quiet, devoid of accusation. It was a simple question. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She couldn't lie to him. "Lord Valerius," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "After my father. After he was executed." She felt him move. He crossed the room in 2 silent strides and knelt before her. It was so unexpected she flinched back, her heart leaping into her throat. He was so close she could see the faint silver strands in his black hair, could feel the chill that emanated from his skin. He reached out a hand, slowly, as if not to startle a wild animal. She squeezed her eyes shut, expecting pain. Instead, his fingers, impossibly gentle, brushed against the collar of her gown. He carefully pushed the fabric aside, exposing the ugly, puckered scar. His touch was cold, so cold it was like being touched by winter itself, but there was no cruelty in it. Only a strange, questing pressure. A tremor ran through her, and then, a spark. Where his icy skin met her scarred flesh, a tiny jolt of warmth, like a single ember, flared to life. The king snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, a sharp hiss escaping his lips. He stared at his fingers, then at her, and for the briefest of moments, she saw a crack in his glacial composure. She saw a flash of raw, agonizing pain in his eyes before the mask of ice slammed back down. He rose and stalked back to the window, turning his back to her. He didn't speak another word that day, but things were different after that. The silent arrangement began to fray at the edges. Small gestures crept into the space between them. A warm cloak would be left on her chair when the night grew colder. A plate of sweet cakes, a delicacy she'd only ever dreamed of, would appear with her meals. She would find an ancient book left open on a table, its pages detailing healing herbs and poultices. She, in turn, began to see past his mask. She saw the profound, bone-deep loneliness in him, the way he watched her, and Fen, with a silent, aching longing. She saw the immense weight he carried, the burden of centuries pressing down on his powerful shoulders. He wasn't just a king, he was a prisoner in his own fortress, in his own skin. He, in turn, began to see past her damage. He saw the quiet resilience, the unyielding core of strength that had allowed her to survive. He saw the kindness she showed the broken pup, a kindness the world had never once shown her. One evening, a blizzard raged outside, rattling the thick glass of the solar windows. The fire was roaring, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Fen was asleep, his head in her lap, and Alara found her own eyelids growing heavy. She must have drifted off. She woke with a start, not because of a sound, but because of a feeling. The feeling of being watched. She opened her eyes. The king was standing over her, so close she could have reached out and touched the black leather of his tunic. His hand was raised, his fingers hovering just inches from her hair. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was stripped bare of its cold mask. In its place was a look of such profound vulnerability and yearning that it stole her breath. He seemed to be about to touch her, to finally bridge the silent gap between them. Then his body went rigid. A violent tremor shook his massive frame. He looked down at his own hand, his eyes widening in horror as a network of black, frost-like veins crawled up his arm from his fingertips. He stumbled back, a choked gasp tearing from his throat. He clutched his arm, his face contorting in agony. It was a pain so immense, so absolute, that it brought the most powerful being she had ever known to his knees. "Your Majesty!" she cried, scrambling to her feet, her own fear forgotten. He didn't answer. He was fighting for breath, his body convulsing. The frost was spreading, climbing his arm, reaching for his chest. The very air around him grew frigid, and a thin layer of ice began to crystallize on the stone floor where he knelt. The doors to the solar burst open. Lord Valerius stood there, flanked by 2 guards. His eyes took in the scene. The king on the floor, Ilara standing over him in terror, and his face twisted into a mask of triumphant fury. "Witch!" he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You see? I warned you." He rushed to the king's side, ignoring Ilara completely. "Your Majesty, you must fight it. Do not let her poison take hold." Kyle looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the killing cold radiating from him. He looked past Valerius, his agonized gaze finding Ilara's. There was a desperate warning in his eyes, a plea. What is happening? Alara demanded, her voice shaking. Valerius turned on her, his eyes blazing with a hatred that was terrifying in its purity. He is the last of his line for a reason, you stupid girl. An ancient curse runs in his blood. The kings of this house cannot love. To feel it, to even let it take root in their hearts, is to invite death. A frost that lives in their very soul awakens and devours them from the inside out. His words hit her like a physical blow. Love. The warmth she'd felt growing in this cold, silent room. It was a poison to him. Her tentative, fragile hope was literally killing him. You did this, Valerius snarled, advancing on her. With your Omega wiles, your pathetic story, you sought to ensnare him, to kill him and seize power for yourself. No, she whispered, shaking her head, tears blurring her vision. I didn't know. Liar, he spat. Seize her. She is a traitor and a kingslayer. The guards moved towards her, their faces grim. Ilara was frozen, her mind reeling from the horror of it all. She had brought this upon him. Her feelings, the first good and warm feelings she had ever known, were a death sentence. The king was weakening. The icy frost was creeping across his chest now, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. He was dying. And it was her fault. The curse was a relentless predator. In the days that followed, Kale grew colder, more distant, not just in spirit but in body. A visible layer of frost, delicate and deadly as a spider's web, began to sheathe his skin. The vibrant, terrifying life that had pulsed around him was being consumed by an encroaching, absolute cold. He locked himself away in his chambers, refusing all visitors, especially her. The order was absolute. She was to stay away. His pain was a constant thrum in the fortress, a silent scream that echoed in the stone. Ilara felt it in her own bones. Every labored breath he took was a shard of ice in her heart. She had done this. Valerius made sure the entire pack knew it. He stood before the gathered nobles and alphas in the great hall, his voice ringing with righteous fury. The Omega, the branded traitor's daughter, has poisoned our king. She used dark magic to awaken the curse that has slept for centuries. She has brought death to our gates. Whispers turned to angry murmurs, then to outright calls for her blood. She was dragged from her room, her simple wool dress feeling like a shroud. They saw her not as a person but as the embodiment of all their fears. The witch. The kingslayer. Valerius stood before her, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. For the crime of high treason and the attempted murder of the Alpha King, you are sentenced to death. You will be thrown from the highest peak at dawn. She looked at the faces in the crowd. There was no mercy there, only fear and hatred. They needed someone to blame, and she, the branded Omega, was the perfect sacrifice. She didn't beg, she didn't cry. A strange calm had settled over her. If Kale was going to die, then her own life meant nothing. Her only regret was that she couldn't see him one last time, to tell him she was sorry. They locked her in a cold, dark cell in the dungeons. But they had made one critical mistake. They had forgotten about Fen. The pup she had saved from the pit was no longer a pup. In the weeks he had spent in the fortress, eating rich food and sleeping by a warm fire, he had grown. He was now a young wolf, sleek and powerful, his gray fur thick and healthy. His twisted leg still made him limp, but it was a mark of his history, not a weakness. It was a reminder of the death he had cheated. He had been in the solar when they took her. When the guards came for her now, to lead her to her execution, a low growl echoed from the shadows of her cell. Fen stepped into the torchlight. He was not the largest wolf in the pack, not by far. But there was something in his stance, in the unnerving intelligence of his golden eyes, that gave the guards pause. His loyalty was not to the pack, not to the Alpha. It was to her. It was absolute and terrifying. He placed his body between Ilara and the door, a deep, rumbling threat vibrating in his chest. His teeth were bared, and they were not the teeth of a pup. "Get that deformed cur out of the way!" The head guard snapped, unnerved. One of the guards lunged forward with a catchpole. Fen moved with a speed that was shocking in a creature with his injury. He ducked under the pole, sprang forward, and sank his teeth into the guard's arm. The man screamed, dropping the pole with a clatter. The other guards drew their swords, but they hesitated. To harm a wolf within the pack was a grave offense, even a deformed one. And this wolf was different. He fought not with mindless aggression, but with a cold, calculated fury. He was protecting his own. From behind the locked door of the king's chambers, far down the hall, came a ragged, desperate cough. It was a sound of breaking ice, of lungs fighting for a single breath. Kale. That sound shattered Alara's despair. She would not die in a cell while he was dying in his room. She would not let Valerius win. Fen. Enough, she said, her voice quiet but firm. The wolf immediately released the guard's arm and backed away, though the growl never left his throat. He stood beside her, a silent, lethal guardian. I have to get to him, she whispered, more to herself than to the wolf. The standoff was a stalemate. The guards were afraid of the wolf, but they had their orders. Alara's mind raced. The execution was at dawn. She had only hours. Then she saw it. A small grate high on the wall of her cell. A ventilation shaft, likely leading up through the fortress kitchens. It was impossibly small, but she was small too. Fen, she commanded, her voice urgent. Distract them. Don't let them follow. The wolf seemed to understand. He let out a ferocious bark and lunged at the guards again, driving them back from the cell door. In the chaos, Alara dragged a small stool to the wall, hoisted herself up, and squeezed through the narrow grate. It was a tight fit, scraping her skin raw, but she pulled herself into the suffocating darkness of the shaft. She crawled through the vents, the sounds of shouting and Fen snarling fading behind her. She moved by instinct, following the faint scent of wood smoke that meant she was getting closer to the king's solar, which was just below his private chambers. She emerged, covered in soot and grime, into the silent, empty solar. The fire was just embers. Fen's den of furs was empty. A profound sense of loss filled the room. She ran to the heavy oak door that led to the king's chambers. It was locked, barred from the outside. Valerius had made him a prisoner. She could hear his breathing now. It was shallow, rattling, the sound of a man drowning in ice. Kale, she whispered, pressing her hands flat against the cold wood. Kale, I'm here. A faint, agonized groan was her only reply. There was no time. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a heavy iron fire poker. It was a desperate, foolish idea. But it was the only one she had. She hefted it, the weight of it straining her arms, and began to batter at the lock. The noise was deafening, echoing through the silent fortress. But she didn't care. The lock splintered. The wood groaned and broke. She threw her shoulder against the door and it swung inward. The cold that hit her was not natural. It was the cold of a tomb, a cold that leached the warmth from the very air. Kale was on the floor, curled in on himself. His body was almost completely encased in a shimmering, crystalline layer of ice. Only his face was partially free, his lips blue, his eyes closed. The black, frost-like veins of the curse covered every inch of his visible skin. He was barely breathing. He was dying. She fell to her knees beside him, the cold from his body seeping through the wool of her dress, chilling her to the bone. Kale, she sobbed, tears freezing on her cheeks. His eyelids fluttered open. His ice-blue eyes, now clouded with pain, found hers. Alara, he rasped, his voice a bare whisper of cracking ice. Run. Save. Yourself. No, she said, her voice thick with grief and a sudden, defiant rage. I won't leave you. Too late. For me, he breathed, a final shuddering sigh escaping his lips. His eyes closed. The faint rise and fall of his chest stilled. He was gone. A scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure, primal agony. No. She would not accept it. She had not survived the kennels, the brand, the hatred of her pack, only to find the one person who saw her and then watch him die because of her. She refused. She laid her hands on his frozen chest. The cold was so intense, it was a physical pain, burning her skin. She closed her eyes, blocking out everything. The cold, the fear, the sound of guards shouting in the hallway. She focused on the single tiny spark of warmth she had felt when he'd first touched her brand. A connection. She poured all of her will, all of her love, all of her defiance into that single point of contact. She thought of Fen, the broken pup she had refused to let die. She thought of Kale, the broken king she now refused to let die. A single, desperate, impossible command formed in her mind. A prayer screamed into the void. Live. Something inside her broke. A dam of pain and fear and loneliness that she had carried her entire life shattered. And from the ruins, a flood of pure, golden light erupted. It poured from her hands, not as heat, but as life itself. It was the warmth of the sun after a long winter, the green of new shoots breaking through frozen earth. The light was blinding, filling the room with a brilliant golden radiance. It sank into Kale's body, not melting the ice, but obliterating it, turning it to vapor. The brand on her neck flared with an unbearable heat. She cried out as the circle of scarred flesh burned, not with the pain of a brand, but with the fire of purification. The ancient mark, the symbol of her shame, glowed bright gold and then simply vanished. Where the ugly scar had been, her skin was now clean, smooth, and untouched. The black frost-like veins on Kale's skin receded from the golden light like shadows from the dawn. Color returned to his face. The blue of his lips faded to a healthy pink. He took a deep, shuddering breath. And his eyes snapped open. They were no longer clouded with pain. They were clear, sharp, and blazing with a light that mirrored the one pouring from her hands. He looked at her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. The doors to the chamber crashed open. Valerius stood there, sword in hand, flanked by a dozen guards. He stared, his mouth agape, at the scene before him. The king, alive. Ilara, kneeling over him, glowing like a fallen star. The golden light faded from her hands, leaving her breathless and drained, but the warmth remained. Kale sat up, moving with a fluid power that had been absent for weeks. He looked stronger than ever before. He reached out and cupped her face, his touch no longer cold, but warm. For the first time, truly warm. "You saved me," he breathed, his voice filled with a wonder that cracked through centuries of ice. "I refuse to lose you," she whispered back, her strength failing her. She swayed and he caught her, pulling her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. His heart was beating, strong and steady against her ear. Valerius finally found his voice. It was a strangled, disbelieving shriek. "What is this sorcery? Seize them! The witch has enchanted him." None of the guards moved. They stared at their king, who was not just alive, but radiating a vitality they had never seen. They stared at the Omega, who was no longer branded, who had faced down death itself, and won. A low growl came from the doorway. Fen limped into the room, his fur matted with blood that was not his own. He came to stand beside Ilara, planting himself firmly at her side, his golden eyes fixed on Valerius with lethal intent. Kyle rose to his feet, pulling Ilara up with him. He kept one arm wrapped securely around her waist, claiming her, protecting her. He looked at Valerius, and for the first time, Ilara saw the full, terrifying power of the Alpha King unleashed not as cold fury, but as burning rage. His eyes began to glow, a pale silver light emanating from their depths. "You have governed my pack for a decade, Valerius." Kale's voice was dangerously quiet, a low thunder that promised a storm. "You told me the curse was absolute, that any connection, any warmth, would be my end." "It is," It was, Valerius stammered, taking a step back. She is a witch, I tell you. She is a healer, Kale corrected, his voice dropping even lower. Her life magic is the perfect counter to the death in my blood. A balance. Something the ancient texts spoke of. Texts you assured me were lost. Understanding dawned on Alara's face. Valerius hadn't just been ignorant. He had been lying. You knew, Kale continued, his voice like the grinding of glaciers. You knew there was a chance, a cure, a balance to be found. But you preferred a king who was isolated, cold, weakened by his own loneliness, a king you could control. Valerius's face went pale. The truth was out, exposed in the light of the king's fury. You tried to kill the one person in this world who could save me, Kale said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He looked down at Alara, his glowing eyes softening for a fraction of a second. You tried to kill my queen. The word hung in the air, more powerful than any edict, more binding than any law. Queen. Valerius made a fatal mistake. He lunged, not at the king, but at Alara, his sword raised. If I can't have the pack, no one will. He never reached her. Kyle moved faster than sight, a blur of black leather and silver light. He caught Valerius's sword arm, and the sound of bone snapping echoed in the silent room. Valerius screamed. Kyle ripped the sword from his hand and threw it aside. He did not kill him. His punishment was far more fitting. You sentenced her to the pit, Kale snarled, his voice raw with fury. You will take her place. Guards, take this traitor to the dungeons. Strip him of his titles, his lands, his name. He is Omega now. Let him learn what it means to be worthless. The guards, their faces grim with a newfound loyalty, seized the weeping, broken Valerius and dragged him away. Silence descended on the room, broken only by their breathing. Kyle turned back to Alara, his rage vanishing as if it had never been. He gently traced the spot on her neck where the brand had been. I am sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion, for all of it. For what he did to you. For what I almost let happen. You didn't know, she whispered. I should have, he said. From the moment I saw you, I felt it. A warmth in the winter of my soul. It terrified me. I thought it was the curse, but it was the cure. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. It was you. He held her then, in the cold room made warm by her light, and for the first time in centuries, the Alpha King was not alone. And Alara, the branded Omega, finally had a name worth keeping. Months passed. The winter snows thawed, giving way to the vibrant green of a northern spring. The fortress, once a place of cold silence, was now filled with a quiet, hopeful warmth. Lord Valerius languished in the dungeons, his cruelty forgotten, his power broken. The pack, witnessing the king's transformation and the quiet, unyielding strength of his chosen mate, had shifted its allegiance. Fear had been replaced by a fierce, protective respect. Ilara was no longer the girl from the kennels. She walked the halls of the fortress not as a servant, but as its heart. Her title was queen, but the pack called her the healer. She tended to the sick, her touch a soothing balm, her presence a promise of life. The brand was gone, but its memory remained, a reminder of how far she had come. It fueled her compassion, ensuring that no one in the pack would ever be deemed worthless again. Fen was her constant shadow. He had grown into a magnificent, formidable wolf, his size and strength belying his twisted leg. The limp was a part of him, a symbol of his resilience. Kale had named him the first of the Queen's Guard, a position of immense honor. Other wolves now vied for a place by his side, but Fen's loyalty remained singular. He was Alara's wolf, first and always. He was feared by their enemies and loved by his queen, and that was all that mattered. The curse in Kale's blood was not gone. It was a dormant beast, held at bay by the constant, steady warmth of Alara's life magic. Their bond was a delicate, living balance. When he held her hand, she could feel the faint residual chill deep within him, a hum of ancient death. And he, in turn, could feel the radiant life flowing from her. A sun that kept his internal winter from freezing him solid. They were two halves of a whole, one of death, one of life, forever bound in a state of equilibrium. One evening, they sat by the fire in the solar, the same room where she had once served him in terrified silence. Now it was their sanctuary. Her head rested on his shoulder, his arms securely around her. Fen was asleep at their feet, his massive body twitching as he dreamed of the hunt. "Do you ever miss the silence?" she asked softly, watching the flames dance. Kyle was quiet for a moment. The silence was not peace. He finally answered, his voice a low rumble against her ear. It was an absence, a void. I spent centuries mistaking emptiness for control. He tightened his grip on her. You are the first sound I have wanted to hear in 1,000 years. She smiled, a genuine, easy smile that had become more frequent in these past months. The self-doubt, the ingrained feeling of worthlessness, was a ghost that still haunted the corners of her mind, but its power was fading. Every time he looked at her, every time he touched her, he banished it a little further into the shadows. He saw her not as the world had, but as she truly was. And in his eyes, she was learning to see herself. He looked down at the great gray wolf sleeping at their feet. "You saved the one creature everyone else threw away," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. "You saw worth where they saw only imperfection." He turned his gaze back to her, his ice-blue eyes warm with a love that was no longer a poison, but a salvation. "And in doing so," he whispered, "you saved us all." She knew their life would not be simple. The curse was a constant threat. Enemies beyond their borders would test their reign. There were still those within the pack who whispered and watched with jealous eyes. The fight was not over. But as she sat there, wrapped in the arms of her king, with her loyal wolf at her feet, Alara knew she would never be alone in the fight again. She had a home. She had a pack. She had a purpose. She had love. The branded girl from the pit had found her place, not as a servant or an outcast, but as the living, breathing heart of a new world, a world she had healed with a single, defiant choice to love what everyone else had abandoned.